Good morning, good afternoon to all of you, wherever you are. Now, first of all, thanks to the hosts and organizers for setting up this very timely conference. We're going to focus on refugees and migrants. As we all know, the numbers have increased at exceptional speed over the past decades. At the end of 2019, there were close to 80 million people forcibly displaced around the world. 80% of them were displaced in countries and areas where there was acute food insecurity and malnutrition. Altogether, we have an estimated 272 million people, international migrants. That means 272 million people, individual destinies, exposed to risks, exposed to violence, exposed to COVID, not the least. 272 million people, individual destinies searching for shelter, for protection, for a better future, or fleeing environmental catastrophes in their home areas. We are going to hear experts in various areas shed light on how these 272 million people are living. And keep in mind that these were numbers from before COVID. The pandemic put additional pressure, of course, on everyone, including and not the least, the refugees and migrants. We're going to hear J Towle, Deputy Director of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, New Zealand, Leslye Orloff, Director, National Immigrants Women's Advocacy Project at the American University Washington College of Law in the US, Ghida Anani, Founder and Director of ABAD, Resource Center for Gender Equality, Lebanon. We are also going to hear Uzoma Agwu, President, Forward Ahead Educational and Healthcare Initiative, Nigeria. We're going to hear from Lilla Hárdi, Cordelia Foundation, Hungary, and Balakrishnan Rajagopal, Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. But before I give the floor or screen to Richard, I'm going to present to you a couple of powerful voices. Here we go.
Hi, my name is Julie. I was working as a volunteer in Moria camp during the first COVID-19 lockdown on Lesvos. So when I started in February, everything was very normal. The operations of the NGOs were in full swing, mostly responding to the massive overcrowding of the camp that was at the time holding 20,000 people. But when Greece went into lockdown, as volunteer aid workers, we were faced with a difficult dilemma whether to stay or to leave. The camp itself had gone on lockdown and access was restricted for many organizations already. It was unclear what exactly my colleagues and I would be able to get done if we'd stay. We also lacked a lot of information on the effect of COVID-19 at the time. So as you do, you start asking yourself questions, if I were to get infected, how sick would I get? Am I ready to stay on the island knowing medical services would be limited, but also not knowing when you would be able to go home again? What eventually persuaded me to stay was the thought that 20,000 other people were stuck in a camp with the same questions, but just didn't have the liberty to get on a plane and leave. I felt a kind of sense of responsibility and privilege to stay and keep working safely to help others stay safe as well. So working on Lesvos in the months leading up to the major fire was quite surreal. It was very frustrating to work in a situation where the simplest measures like social distancing, washing your hands regularly, or isolating is very difficult to implement, especially in especially in the case of massive overcrowding in and around the camp. And the effect of a lockdown and segregation from the rest of the city meant further restriction of freedom for the residents. So how I see it is that the fire symbolizes a cry for help from isolation and of mounting despair, but mostly an expression of free will. But I think that no one had expected this to happen to that extent. The night of the fire, I was back in the Netherlands. I stayed up all night trying to reach my colleagues on the ground, trying to make sense of what was happening. I think the first thing that went through my mind was, is everyone safe? The following days, I felt quite overwhelmed with a feeling of helplessness, being so mentally engulfed in a situation, but so physically far was really difficult for me to accept. I think there's one more thing I'd like to say about what we can learn from the events that happened on Lesvos, and that's the key to minimizing an outbreak of COVID-19 in this case was the effort to disseminate accurate information about ways to protect yourself in this particular situation, in this particular context of restriction and overcrowding. At the same time, normalizing the use of masks, doing elbow touches or hand waves instead of handshakes, using hand disinfectant and distributing soap to the residents were things that we could do to help protect them and each other. But while this disease manifests itself physically, it is clear that it's also mostly a mental one. And looking back, I find it really hard to judge otherwise. Thank you.
We are also going to hear from Kurdistan, I believe.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pshtiwan Faraj. I am program manager at independent media organization in Kurdistan in northern part of Iraq. I'm happy to participate in this international summit, and today I'm going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the internally displaced people in Iraq. In Iraq, we have more than 1.5 million internally displaced people in the Kurdistan Autonomous Region of Iraq. In Iraq, as elsewhere, the coronavirus pandemic is having severe impacts on the entire population. But IDPs, that is internally displaced people, among them the elderly people, women, a person with disability, and children and the youth are more severely affected than other groups in Iraq. And women and girls are more at risk and withstand more pressure during the pandemic. They bear most of the burden of cleaning the house, preparing food, taking care of the sick and the elderly people, and women and girls face increasing risks of violence during the pandemic. And generally, IDPs have less access to information on COVID than the host community, and they are more likely to be unable to protect themselves from the disease. The incomes of the IDPs and their livelihood are more affected by the coronavirus prevention than those if compared with the host community, and also access to sexual and reproductive health services are extremely limited among the IDPs. This puts IDPs, elderly women, among the internally displaced people at the risk of mortality that could have been otherwise prevented. And the current pandemic presents unprecedented challenges for internally displaced people in general, the elderly people, women's health, livelihood, safety, and representation. We have carried out research, data surveys, and we are working on the field, in the ground. We are supporting hundreds of thousands of IDPs who are displaced in the Kurdistan Autonomous Region. Our organization calls on the public authorities and humanitarian agencies to protect IDPs, the elderly people, children, from physical, psychological, and economic violence. And we are ready to cooperate with international NGOs to enhance their participation in the COVID response and to prevent much needed intervention. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for those powerful voices from Lesbos and Kurdistan. I'm going to hand it over to you, Richard. The floor or screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Liv, and to the organizers of this very timely discussion. And we're all locked away in our own little places, but one of the advantages of this comfort we have now is we're able to link each other up across the world to get a better sense of really what is going on, because isolation for us in the privileged parts of the world is one thing, but isolation when you are already a desperately vulnerable and marginalized group such as refugees and displaced people is something else in terms of disempowerment and intensity. So thank you for allowing us to shed a brief moment of spotlight on the situation of refugees and displaced people. It's what the Secretary General has described as a horrifying surge of violence in the community and at the family level as a direct or partial consequence of the phenomenon of COVID around the world. COVID, of course, is affecting everybody everywhere in different ways and forms, but refugees and displaced people already have a heightened level of vulnerability. They are escaped from their own homes and communities, the safety of things that they know and are supported. They find themselves in foreign places and are often exposed. They're invisible. They have no access to the mainstream. Many lack documentation. So if you superimpose the impact of COVID on already highly vulnerable individuals and communities, you get the perfect storm. The consequence for displaced people who are living in fragile states, often in marginalized urban environments or in camp situations in places often of conflict, you add to that the impact of lockdowns, the inability to socially distance in any meaningful way, the collapse of the education system. Here in New York, we're worried that kids are moving to online education, but in many parts of the world, the schools have simply ceased to exist in terms of providing safety and security and education for kids. If you add to that the poverty and the collapse of the informal employment sector, where income generation, particularly for women, is largely disappeared, then you have the perfect storm of impact. So all of these factors, as we've seen, and often it's difficult to get decent information and empirical data and analysis because we don't have access to many of the situations where these traumas are playing out. These elements conspire in the family and in the community to generate much higher levels of domestic violence. If you add into that alcohol, drugs, depression, psychosocial damage to communities and family structures, there are no safety valves for many people who are suffering. And these conflict zones where refugees and displaced people find themselves are underfunded, chronically underfunded in some situations, and forgotten in many humanitarian situations. The IRC, the International Rescue Committee, conducted a survey in 15 countries recently in Africa, and it's a snapshot. It's not confined to Africa. It's a snapshot of some of the things that are happening around the world. That 73% of the people who were consulted reported an increase in intimate violence, partner violence in the family homes. Domestic violence was dramatically increasing. 51% reported an increase in sexual violence, not just within the family, but within the community. And of course, layered onto that is conflict-related sexual violence, which is an endemic problem for many communities around the world. 32% reported an increase in early forced marriages and trafficking. So the collapse of the schooling system, the dramatic disempowerment of women and families in their community cycles has dramatically disempowered them and made them prey to trafficking and all the odious damage that can come from exploitation. We do not get a good sense of how much is going on because the lack of access and because of the stigma attached to these heightened levels of violence within the privacy often of the family and the community, where these things are often not talked about. So what we hear and the statistics that we gather are probably the tip of the iceberg. Time will prevent me from going into any more detail on this. I'm happy to discuss these issues in more detail, but where do we go? Well, clearly there is a heightened level of awareness in the United Nations. The Secretary General has prioritized this as a very important issue that has to be focused on. Violence in the communities, violence against women and children, the girl child, is something that has to be very much in the combined response of the United Nations going forward. But of course, that's not enough. The funding, the organization of programs has to now be replicated at the community level. Women need to be empowered to participate in the design of programs that lead to their protection and security. They need to be re-empowered and to re-secure the agency that has been deprived of them in these last 6 to 9 months. So participation is absolutely critical to break the endemic cycles of violence that we're seeing going on. There are lots of creative things and programs going on. There are helplines. There are information campaigns, which are very important. The participation of men and male leadership in these community structures is going to be extremely important. And also providing the safety net of access to services, counseling, both physical and psychosocial, is imperative if we're going to prevent any long-term damage to people who are already damaged as a result of the situations they find themselves in pre-COVID. So these are some of the challenges that lie ahead of us. And this is why this kind of forum that reflects communities, NGOs, civil society, faith-based organizations, and international organizations is so critically important to create an awareness and to keep that spotlight on what will otherwise become an invisible but tragic situation for millions of people, vulnerable people around the world today. So thank you very much. I'll pass the mic back to you, Liv.
Thank you very much for that sobering spotlight, Richard. I'm going to hand it over to Leslye.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me get my screen set up. Hold on. Can I share my screen? I think so. Let's see if this works. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. My name is Leslye Orloff, and I direct the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project at American University Washington College of Law. And I've been working with immigrant and refugee and migrant survivors of domestic violence, child abuse, sexual assault for about 38 years now in the United States, and was involved in drafting the immigration protections of the Violence Against Women Act over the course of a couple of decades. What I want to talk to you about today has to do with what immigrant victims of domestic violence and child abuse are experiencing right now in the United States, and how that is amplified, as you've heard from other speakers, by the COVID-19 crisis. This is our contact information, and we've got materials related to this summit that will be available to you. Hopefully we'll get to just figure out how to distribute them to you, but this is our contact information if you have questions. What I want to do is start by talking very briefly about one of the things that we found in the US, and I'm sure it's in other places, but where a perpetrator of domestic violence can control the immigration status of his spouse or child, that in over 70% of the time, the perpetrator doesn't file immigration papers that they're able to file. And that when that perpetrator in the US is a US citizen married to a foreign-born spouse, we find that because of this type of immigration-related abuse, power, and control, the abuse rate jumps to almost 3 times the national average and about 60% in those families. For years, we've been working in the US to create forms of immigration relief that are available to help immigrant crime victims who are victims of domestic violence and child abuse. Sometimes there's overlaps between domestic violence and human trafficking. Sometimes there are obviously lots of family violence cases where the abuser isn't a US citizen or lawful permanent resident spouse. And this is the full range of remedies that are available under US immigration laws to help immigrant survivors. And one of the problems we've run into, and the particular challenges related to COVID, have been that with the increased isolation and the difficulties with language access to services, what happens is, in order for an immigrant survivor, an immigrant survivor's ability to access help from police, from prosecutors, from victim services, from the courts, from welfare agencies, and et cetera. The key to that is filing for immigration relief. That the sooner somebody is identified as somebody who's eligible for one of these forms of relief, and the sooner that they file, the more likely it is that they will be able to get the supports and assistance that are available in our system, because the fear of deportation remains a huge barrier for immigrant survivors. And so filing for immigration relief leads to enhanced access to public benefits, better outcomes for custody, protection orders, divorce, and family court, better outcomes in criminal cases, and protection from deportation, legal work authorization, driver's licenses, and the like. And what we found is with immigrant victims, by and large, they don't access the system without the assistance of an attorney or an advocate. And so one of the challenges in COVID has been those attorneys and advocates that are that bridge to the help and the system we have available under our laws often have misinformation about what immigrant victims qualify for, particularly in light of COVID. The other thing that's a challenge is we have, with the increased isolation that has come from stay-at-home orders and that already existed in some of our rural communities, immigrant victims need to be able to access immigration lawyers, and they are not always living in the same towns as where the victims are. And so we've come up with a remote model of representation that we've tested with farm worker women in California, victims of domestic violence, that is working exceptionally well, where their local victim advocate that they know and trust is working remotely with a lawyer in another part of the country to get these immigration cases filed. And because of COVID, the state of New York is now looking into adopting that model and applying it throughout the state to address COVID, but also as a best practice for serving victims moving forward. And the last point I want to make has to do with many immigrant victims of domestic violence and child abuse in this country are on paths to legal immigration status related to their victimization, one of the paths I showed you earlier. And there's a lot of misinformation out there about what victims can get. Under our laws, victims who need healthcare related to testing and treatment of COVID, for example, can get that paid for through emergency Medicaid. They can get help from migrant and community health clinics. And once they file immigration relief, in many states, they can get full access to healthcare, subsidized healthcare. The economic relief that the US government was issuing, many immigrants, anybody with a social security number and work authorization generally qualifies for those, and any working children of theirs qualifies for those payments. Housing, most of the housing relief that has come forward from the US government and Congress regarding helping people stay in their homes, there are no immigrant restrictions on any payments made to landlords or to states. And so the vast majority of that money can help people without regard to immigration status. And finally, unemployment insurance. Many immigrant victims who begin the process of filing for immigration relief will actually get work authorization long before they have legal status in the United States, legal immigration status. And so if they have legal work authorization, they and a social security number, they qualify for the COVID-related unemployment insurance as well. We have a map that helps people figure out, that's an interactive map where somebody in the US can go and say, because what public benefits and services people qualify varies by state and by immigration status. And so to make it easy, we created a map where people can look up by status what people qualify for. And I will stop it there and hand you back the podium, so to speak. Thank you so much for hosting this today and for giving me the opportunity to share at least some of what's happening in the US. Thank you so much.
I'm going to hand it over further to Ghida Anani. Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for engaging a voice from the Middle East and Lebanon in this very much important event and summit. Needless to say that humanitarian emergencies and natural disasters and global pandemic put refugees, especially women and children, at increased risk and vulnerability. And the current COVID-19 crisis is surely no exception. Generally speaking, the best way to achieve peace everywhere is by simply reducing violence everywhere. And violence against women and children being one of the most widespread and persistent and devastating forms of human rights violation in our world today, that addressing it is non-questionable, and it occurs in every country around the world and affects every home. In Lebanon, though we lack accurate data about the magnitude of the problem, data available at the level of civil society organizations, cases reported to the police or reported in the media, showcase that violence is affecting all women and girls and throughout their cycle of lives. Abad, the organization that I manage, since its establishment in 2011, has been striving to educate, prevent, support survivors, shift social norms, influence policies to ensure gender equality and nonviolence. And one of the major achievements of our work was contributing to the endorsed National Action Plan on 1325, abolishing Article 522, which was related to marrying your rapist law, and creating a national wave to promote our 24/7 Safe Line by launching our recent campaign, Lockdown, Not Lock Up, which was aiming at promoting nationwide solidarity towards women survivors of GBV during the lockdown and specifically reaching out to refugees. Violence is definitely holding us back, and it's time to come together around a commitment to halving global violence by 2030 and build a better future. And fostering protection against women and children, people with special needs, and other vulnerable groups is not only the right thing to do, but also a smart investment to make, and it's definitely possible. The evidence is violence is still on the rise, and the question is what we know only the top of the iceberg? The evidence is as well, we know how to prevent it, but the question is, are we all playing the right and full responsible role to set up political will and tangible actions? And the evidence is preventing and reducing protection risks and violence and investing in peace is a sound investment. But the question is where we are investing and in what and how. In my modest opinion, as an activist and a feminist, and here allow me to seize the opportunity of this much important platform and summit, just to convey a few questions of reflection around how we're serving the right holders, specifically refugees, and how much we're able to achieve on the level of reducing gender-based violence. As an activist, I can confirm that what has been done is huge and reflective of massive coordinated effort on multiple levels to save women and children lives and ensure their well-being, safety, and dignity. But to be self-critical, though, we can surely know much more and do even greater by doing some of these actions. First, assessing our interventions fearlessly through the lens of the right holders themselves to ensure their engagement, voice, and prioritization of their concerns. Secondly, ensuring gender-sensitive, holistic, and intersectional interventions, especially between livelihood, peace and security, protection agenda, and the humanitarian agenda, to increase effectiveness and efficiency and sustainable impact. Prioritizing the meaningful participation of women and girls who are working on the front line of GBV prevention and response. And here the question was always how much, like really, we're working for the refugees, how much we are making them at the core and at the heart of what we're doing. Fourth, building strong mechanisms for follow-up and accountability, while engaging local stakeholders, particularly women-led and women rights CSOs and girl-led groups and networks in the identification, development, and evaluation of any follow-up and accountable processes. 5, fostering safe and people-friendly communication of information mechanisms to ensure it's accessible to all. The right holders, especially kids, elderlies, people with special needs from the refugee community do not know about existence of services, and if they know, they have no means to connect, and if they have, they know their communication is traceable in many countries, and especially in the Middle East and Lebanon, namely. 6, adopting innovative innovative GBV prevention and response activities, working with the right holders themselves as couples, communities, workplaces, decision makers, schools, faith-based groups, and others. 7, ensure effective application of state due diligence principle in practice and not in literature, meaning designing the programming around fostering real state autonomy and accountability as outcome rather than dependency and non-cumulative memory of experiences. And lastly, investing in people rather than numbers. And apologies for the boldness, but not acknowledging people's aspirations, potentials, capacities, and priorities, especially in refugee community. This will not lead us to a brighter future where they lead on its building themselves. What is needed is an acceleration of action, political will, and an increase in smart data-driven investment. Violence is definitely holding us back, but it's time to come together in a commitment to change this reality. And I would just want to conclude on like the commemorating like next week, the International Day for Ending Violence Against Women and Girls. We need to take collective action to end all forms of violence everywhere so that all women and girls are safe at home, online, in their cities and communities and everywhere around the globe. Thank you. Thank you, Liv.
Thank you very much. Lebanon is a country that many of us hold dear, and we know what challenges you're confronted with. So that was a very good and timely reminder of those challenges, some of those challenges. And I'd like to also thank you for underlining so clearly that we actually know how to deal with many of these challenges. It's a question of, among others, political will, and building this strong movement, focusing and aiming for halving global violence, I think is a critical issue here. We have to build the movement stronger. And in that spirit, I'm going to hand it over to Uzoma from Nigeria. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really very excited to be part of this very important summit. Thank you, Diane, for making me speak. I will be talking about the experience in a third world community. I'm the president of the Forward Ahead, an educational and health initiative. In late 2019, as we celebrate Christmas, the news of a fast-spreading disease was in the air. In early 2020, we began to realize we are in for a life-changing event, the COVID-19 pandemic. Our prayer was, let the great powers conquer it, so we don't have to, have it to contend with. But that was not to be. Health systems all over the world were beaten to standstill, and we just waited for our fate. Not long afterwards, borders started closing up, and the scale was really unbearable. From external border closure came interstate border closure in Nigeria. Many people were taken unawares. Many were far from family. Many were far from businesses. Many were away for business, and many were far away for holiday in a totally unfamiliar environment. Many were home, hopeful to return to school after strikes by lecturers in the university. Up to now, the lecturers are still on strike in Nigeria. Many were not prepared for what came upon them. I was lucky to have driven into my state before the borders were closed. Few hours later, how lucky? Because after hearing what happened, to people that were not able to make it in just on time, I was just grateful that I was in on time. As an announcement was made about the restriction of movement, members of the police used terror in the guise of obeying instructions from government. The little funds available for people were taken from them for permission to cross over to where they were going. The young girls were forced to exchange sex for the chance to cross the borders. You hear muffled screams as their dignity is taken from them. Groups of migrants were forced to camp as close to the borders as possible, waiting for opportunities to cross. They just camp with people they don't know. They stay with people they've never seen before. They would stay together with all sorts of people. Now we watch these things on social media platforms and read them in the newspapers, but we cannot do anything about it because we're also, restricted. During the night, the scavengers scout for pleasure from unwilling hearts. This happens whether you are married or not. No respect for sacredness of marriage, no respect for age, even other women were molested. These were done without protection. And afterwards, the victims were trapped to remain with whatever seed that was planted inside of them. No medication whatsoever, and no knowledge of the even HIV status of who had taken advantage of them. When they finally reached their destinations, they are ashamed to present themselves for help. The person who got me to know about this happening told this story as related by a woman who was a victim. She came for antiretroviral prophylaxis for an affected relative. And I asked her, can I get a voice from this? Can I get to talk to this person? Well, we need to create awareness. We need to let government know what the people they kept at the borders, what they are doing to other people. But it was very difficult to get them to, comfort. The lady could not, let me see even the victim. From border closure, we woke up to a stay-home instruction. What? How on earth are people going to feed? There's this last-minute rush. Businesses were shut down. Widows lost their small businesses and became vulnerable. Schools were closed, so people were forced to stay in the house with people they are not even used to. Fares for road transport skyrocketed. For those ones, they permitted certain kind of vehicles to pass. And some people pay so much to hide in these vehicles to cross from one state to another. Girls were raped while walking home from a long distance on foot. Girls were violated at home while trapped with uncles, in quotes, and neighbors who were restless for lack of what to do with their time. Widows became landlords' mistresses to be able to pay for house rents. Worse still, fathers violated their biological daughters. This picture you saw at the beginning, okay, I didn't put up my presentation. There was a picture of a girl, a little 8-year-old girl that was molested by the father. I will talk about that later. Now, in my antenatal clinic, being a frontliner, we were given a little bit of freedom to also go to the clinic to help out and see pregnant women that are sick during the lockdown period. And I was in the clinic. A pregnant young teenager walked in. She was a student and pregnant. The pregnancy was for a neighbor, she had intercourse with during the lockdown. And this was forced. Same day, another teenager walked into my clinic, pregnant for a fellow student who raped her when she went to collect her notebook. She lent to him, a few weeks before the lockdown. Both of them, after interacting with them, had no intention of going back to school because the shame was too much. And in this part of our country, if you get pregnant, it's almost like everything is over for you. The shame would not allow you to go back to school. Your parents will almost stop your everything, your support, your education, and and they're so ashamed of you. I mean, you are almost like ostracized from society. And when I asked my colleagues about the sudden increase in the number of teenage pregnancies, people were, pregnancies resulting from rape, they said, yes, it's happening to them. They are beginning to see this increased number. And it was like there's an epidemic of teenage pregnancies. And like I said, painfully, most of these patients, these girls will not go back to school. And when I interacted with a FIDA member, this Female Lawyers Association in Ebonyi State, because I'm giving a story that's happening around me and, a little bit around me. I had a lot of story in other states, but I'm specifically talking about what happened in Ebonyi State. she gave me a report of what the ones they were able to, some of these cases they were able to tackle. She told me that they have 3 cases of a father violating his girl child. It was a case of a pastor and an 11-year-old girl, a case of a 16-year-old girl and her cousin, another case of a little girl of 7 years and her cousin. And there are many other cases of, little girls aged 6 to 11 years and the neighbors aged between 20 and 40 years. It was a painful, it was a sad situation. What did we do as an organization? The Forward Ahead Education and Health Initiative, seeks to actually get this group of people. And what we try to do is to ensure that they continue their education. I want to appreciate Barrister Dr. Ugoji for her support. She is a co-founder of this organization, and when we saw this as a big burden, it was almost overwhelming us, but with her support and encouragement, we kept pushing on. We plan to do advocacy visit to parents of these ones. So we have started a clinic for them, and we see this. The clinic was not just to provide free healthcare for these girls and affected the victims. We want to use that as an opportunity to talk to them about going back to school, that having these children is not the end of life, and to let them. Hello?
I think you have a few seconds to wrap up. I'm sorry.
Yes, to continue their education and then provide support for them after that to go back to school. And we're also trying to collaborate with this Lawyers Association and Medical Women Association of Nigeria to provide support and continue to mount the campaign. The challenges of the intervention, one came to us, a family, the woman with the age-old girl that was molested by the father was driven away from home because she reported the husband to the police, and he was arrested, and she was driven. Right now, people are just donating things to keep her family together. So we are like, this is a problem that we have to look at. How do we intervene? How do we get these people that are doing these wrong things to, get them, for the law to catch up with them and yet protect the victims? It's a very big challenge. I'm thinking that the government must have something to do, must do something to ensure that we keep, protecting our girls and protecting our women. And we must establish protective means. Thank you very much for the opportunity that have been given to create this awareness in this room. God bless you very much. Thank you again, Ugoji.
Thank you very much, Uzoma. And I just want to remind everyone that if you have follow-up questions, these panelists have got a lot more to contribute with than what they have the space to give in 5 to 7 minutes. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A box. And with those words, I'm going to hand it over to Lilla, please.
Thank you very much for giving the screen to me. I'm Lilla Hárdi, psychiatrist, psychotherapist, psychoanalyst. I'm speaking to you from Hungary, from a European country, member of the EU. I'm the medical director of a foundation, Cordelia Foundation for the Rehabilitation of Torture Victims. Why I emphasized you that I'm speaking to you from Hungary is that the attitudes towards refugees, migrants, asylum seekers have totally changed recently due to our present political situation. As we are active in the rehabilitation of torture survivor refugees as a civil organization, the hostile attitude has spread and reached also us. So it limited our activity, but I try to introduce what can we do in small and how can we put a special emphasis during this special pandemic era of COVID-19 in Hungary with refugees. Let me share the screen with you. Just 1 second. Yes. Here it is. So this is our small team. Now it has reduced significantly. We are the member of a global network of IRCT, International Rehabilitation and Research Council of Torture Victims. Now, there are more than 160 trauma centers all over the world in the network on a global level in charge of the rehabilitation of torture survivors people. Our therapeutic attitude is holistic, comprehensive, and biopsychosocial, as the trauma of the survivor is damaging the personality on 5 levels, on a somatic, psychological, social, legal, and spiritual level as well. How our numbers are formed during this era, the COVID-19, from January to September. I want to draw your attention that previously we had a caseload of much more than 1,000 patients per year. Now, due to the closure and due to the closure of the borders of Hungary, much before the pandemic has arrived here. Now, from January till September, we had the opportunity to treat 117 patients. Regularly, we offered sessions online, but certain persons had offline sessions and certain persons received mixed on and offline sessions. Of course, people want to leave Hungary as quickly as they can due to this hostile, reluctant attitude to offer asylum for people. What are the effects of COVID-19 on the refugees, torture survivors, or who are the survivors of extreme traumas during migration? Due to the chronic stress state, post-traumatic stress symptoms returned, like problems with handling aggressive manifestations, impulsive behavior, sleep disorders, nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety, depression, and addictive behavior. Due to chronic stress factors, impulsive behavior, domestic and family violence had significantly increased. Due to the return of traumatic memories, due to the return of previously healed and cured and treated anxiety and mood disorders, they returned and increased again, resulting that abusive manifestations increased in the family and outside the family as well. What are the challenges of offering therapeutic help during pandemic? Being a very small and not a very financially well-equipped country, there is not sufficient internet connection to offer proper therapies. There are not sufficient devices in the migrants, refugees' home. If we employ interpreters, the triadic situation, I mean the therapist, the caregiver, the patient, and the interpreter, is very challenging on phone. It's very difficult to build trust issues with severely broken patients suffering of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's even challenging to give prescription and medication because they are poor, they don't have financial tools to go to the pharmacies and to ask for medication. And of course, what we mourn the most, group therapies can be very rarely realized. What can Cordelia do? Be silent and love, as Shakespeare said in King Lear. We made the Trauma Center for Hungarian victims of violence, offering a special focus on women. We offer individual counseling and short therapies. And I try to be very short. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Lilla, and both for your very precise and good words, and for the hard work that you're doing on the ground. So thank you for that. I'm going to hand it over to Balakrishnan, our last speaker in this round. Please, the screen is yours.
Dear representatives, colleagues, and friends, it is an honor for me to address the International Summit on Domestic and Family Violence as Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing. Together with the other UN experts, let me join the United Nations Secretary General's call for peace at home to put women's safety first when states respond to the pandemic. Housing has emerged as a first line of defense against COVID-19, as governments have called on their citizens to stay at home, work from home, or teach their children at home when schools are closed. At the peak of the COVID-19 emergency response, more than 3.9 billion people, or half of the world's population, were asked or ordered to stay at home by their governments. As set out in my report to the General Assembly, more than 1.8 billion people do not have a decent home and live in informal settlements where physical distancing is difficult or impossible. Many millions, especially migrant workers, persons working in the informal sector, or with low-paid jobs, a majority of whom are women or people of color, have lost their jobs or livelihoods due to the pandemic-induced shutdown and are forced to stay at home. Many of those millions have been evicted or at risk of losing their home and becoming homeless due to the economic impact of the pandemic. And too many people have no home at all and live in street situations or in encampments, among them many internally displaced persons, migrants, refugees, and victims of forced evictions and family violence. Indeed, globally, 243 million women and girls between 15 and 49 years old have been subjected to sexual and/or physical violence perpetrated by an intimate partner in the previous 12 months. According to available data, since the outbreak of COVID-19, violence against women and girls, and particularly domestic violence, has intensified. Very few states have prioritized the tackling of domestic violence during COVID-19 emergency response planning, for example, through increased investment in safe shelters. There is a shortage of safe shelters due to capacity limitations and social distancing measures, compounded by the fact that women and girls confined at home with perpetrators of domestic violence often find it difficult to access shelters. The right to adequate housing, enshrined in international human rights law, means not only to have just a roof above one's head. Housing must not only be adequate, but also safe. Safe for everyone, for women, children, migrants, and refugees. Housing safety must be understood comprehensively. Housing should not only be structurally safe to prevent housing collapses or shield against health risks like COVID-19. Housing safety requires, in addition, safety against domestic, family, and gender-based violence and any other criminality. The pandemic has laid bare that access to adequate and safe housing is not just a housing issue, but indeed an issue of life or death. Our home should not only be a place to protect us and others from a virus, it must also be a place in which we are protected from abuse and harassment. The pandemic has unveiled many pre-existing cracks in our societies, including the lack of effective prevention and protection against domestic and family violence. Situational factors caused by the pandemic, such as being fenced in at a home with a violent family member, the increase of psychological stress through closing of schools, disconnection from friends and social networks, losing employment or fear of being unemployed, or losing your home due to eviction or foreclosure have increased unacceptable levels of domestic violence even further. At the same time, many existing preventive, protective, and support mechanisms for victims of domestic violence have either closed or had to reduce their work or capacity or rapidly change their working methods. The pandemic has highlighted this issue that was already well known before. As the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women has documented, there is a lack of adequate temporary emergency housing for victims of domestic violence, to which women, children, LGBT persons, migrants, and refugees are more likely exposed and are therefore at risk of increased homelessness. In addition, in many countries, there is a considerable lack of affordable long-term housing solutions for victims of domestic, family, and gender-based violence. Both short-term and long-term housing programs, including those for the allocation of social housing, should therefore prioritize women and families escaping violence. In some jurisdictions, certain requirements such as proof of a local or valid residence permit exclude migrants, displaced persons, and refugees from accessing emergency housing in violation of the right to adequate housing. Furthermore, much of the existing emergency housing for migrants, displaced persons, and refugees, such as camps or collective accommodations, does not provide sufficient privacy and protection to women and their children to shield them effectively against family and gender-based violence. A matter of great concern to me is that regrettably, forced evictions have continued, if not accelerated, during the pandemic. The victims of such evictions, including women, children, refugees, migrant workers, and many other vulnerable groups, are now facing worsening conditions with heightened risk of being homeless or exposed to family or gender-based violence and the pandemic. I have therefore called upon states to halt all eviction proceedings during the pandemic, including against non-national residents, and to end the sweeping of encampments or tents of migrants, refugees, and homeless people. While all evictions should be banned during the pandemic, law enforcement agencies must continue to protect victims of family and domestic violence, including through restraining orders. In cases of domestic violence, victims should not have to flee their homes. Instead, the perpetrators of such violence must be effectively prohibited from accessing the homes of their victims. If someone must flee from family or gender-based violence, they should not become homeless or be forced to return to an unsafe home to be shared with a violent partner or family member. Special measures must be taken to ensure access to safe housing for single females, underage migrants, and refugees who are at elevated risk of becoming victims of domestic, family, and gender-based violence or trafficking, both inside and outside refugee camps or settlements of displaced persons. Dear friends, going back to the way things were cannot be a viable option. COVID-19 has exposed the fragility of pre-existing protections for victims of family or gender-based violence and made it worse in many cases. It has shown the increased economic vulnerability of women and girls impacted by the pandemic shutdown. It has revealed the pandemic of domestic violence, which predates the COVID-19 pandemic. It has shown how badly prepared many countries are in finding adequate shelter and long-term housing options for victims of family violence. In this crucial moment, we need to join forces and acknowledge that we all share responsibilities to ensure that everyone has access to safe and adequate housing. Only together we can make sure that no one is left behind. The pandemic has opened a portal of opportunity to do better by shining a light on where we need more work. Let us together walk through that portal. Thank you.
Thank you for that very powerful reminder and appeal for unity and joining forces. We are going to hear from some powerful voices from the ground again as well.
Good day. My name is Halina Skipalska. I'm an executive director of the Ukrainian Foundation for Public Health, a local Ukrainian NGO founded by the Health Right International. COVID-19. I would say that COVID-19 exposed problems in families where they have been hidden or masked. In families where domestic violence was already a problem, COVID-19 exacerbated the situation. We immediately felt the impact of COVID-19 pandemic through the increase of numbers of referrals of domestic violence to mobile teams of psychosocial assistance, daycare centers and shelters by several times. Especially it was difficult for women with aggravating factors, violence and drug addiction, violence and HIV, violence and disability, violence and internal displacement. We have quickly refocused and adapted our services to COVID-19 contexts. Work under lockdown restrictions was a challenge. We organized remote services of psychologists and social workers, and that was not easy. Conducted online events for communities. We quickly purchased personal protective equipment for employees and clients. Trained them how to use it when we work with families. Secondly, I must say good words about business sector, which has stepped up to support the most vulnerable women and children. This help included not only personal protective equipment, but also food packages and medications for the most disadvantaged clients. COVID-19 pandemic has changed lives of many people. Now there are more activists and volunteers who care about problems of others and human rights. Secondly, the pandemic and lockdown restrictions require a rapid response, instructions, changes, new approaches to work with clients and partners. I believe that aid of donor organizations is crucial for all supporters of women's and girls' rights, women of vulnerable groups in low and middle-income countries. It is necessary to provide help to small organizations, and international commitments are an important tool for influencing governments and developing a political will. We are ready to learn and teach others. In my opinion, governments, civil society organizations, agencies such as United Nations, women and men must join together efforts and put clear demands to states for ensuring gender equality, helping the most disadvantaged groups, especially in the context of pandemic and humanitarian crises. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nitwa Ngendakumana Dafroze. Ubiravye kuva kera mukuri namye mpohoterwa, ariko muri aya mezi ndwi hoho vyarunyutse cyane bitewe n'uko twari dusanzwe twugarijwe n'ikiza coronavirus. Rego ingaruka ntizari kubura kuko biragoye kubona kazoza kawe mu gihe utumvikana n'uwo mubakanye. Naragerageje kwitura amashirahamwe ariko ntaco yamfashije, kumva zuko ntari nubatse biciye mu mategeko. Kuri jewe amashirahamwe aharanira agateka k'abakenyezi yodushigikira mu kuduha impanuro no mu kuturemesha, binakenewe bakatuba hafi mu gihe bikenewe ko twitura ubutungane. Ico nosaba leta yacu nuko yodufata mu mugongo mu kutwumviriza no kubahiriza amategeko na cane cane ku bijanye n'ingo n'imiryango.
Thank you for that powerful, strong voice of and experience. We're going to hear from one more voice.
Vienna is a growing city in the heart of Europe. 40% of the almost 2 million population of Vienna, they was born not in Austria. And 30% of the whole population, they don't have Austrian citizenship. Vienna is an experienced city on migration, integration, and diversity management. However, in the recent years, Vienna has adapted the cross-cutting human rights approach for additional inclusion measures. Vienna joined the global movement of human rights cities in 2014. And the City Council of Vienna has approved an official act for declaration the city as a human rights city. We established the Human Rights Office of the Vienna, and since then we work with political administration entities and NGOs and the civil society. We implement the Declaration of the City of Vienna to human rights. Though even before the city of Vienna became a human rights city, we have started with frameworks, with law and regulation on non-discrimination, on participation, accountability, and also transparency. But human rights approach bring us more steps in the implementation and understanding of human rights. Coming to COVID-19, we have to, all local and even the national levels, we have to adapt all of our measures. Look, today is the International Day for Tolerance. And instead of having a conference on the occasion of this day, I'm standing here with a light project, with an artistic project that we try to bring the light and color to the life of a city. So the all local levels that they have already experienced on human rights, they can adapt their knowledge, they can adapt their capacity in their administration, and just in order to dealing better with the crisis and the socio-economic crisis as for the time being we have almost all over the world. Human rights, they are like bridges, and they bring the people together, and the human rights values are fundamentals that we could just go through in this difficult time. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I wish you a good and productive conference.
Thank you very much to Shams Asadi from Vienna. Now we are going to hear from Stephen Fulop, the mayor of Jersey.
Good afternoon to the panel and to all viewers. You know, most people wouldn't think much beyond the obvious impact of the COVID pandemic, but for that very reason, it magnifies the importance of the International Summit on Domestic and Home Violence during COVID, the very reason we're all here today. The fact is, the last 9 months or so, this country has been turned upside down and shaken to its core. For that matter, other parts of the world for nearly a year. This pandemic has done so much more than just what is covered in the headlines, the number of infected and tragically the number of loved ones lost. You may have heard much about the impact the virus has had on the world economy as communities literally shut down in efforts to stop the spread of one of the most deadly viruses known to human history. Kids were kept out of schools, jobs were lost, and the streets were empty as everyone quarantined to some extent to battle something that we still don't quite have a full understanding about. Dealing with the unknown and all of these most unpredictable hardships, many believe may have contributed to the significant surge in another social plague, domestic home violence. The issue of domestic home violence at any time is a serious matter that must be addressed, and with a concentrated effort by all, because it rose at the very foundation of what builds strong communities, and that is families. Some watchers here today may not know we in Jersey City are repeatedly considered the single most diverse city in the United States. I mention this because the familial dynamics range across the full spectrum of socioeconomic and race and ethnic cultures. This was an ever-present factor as we developed strategies in many different languages to provide the full spectrum of medical and mental health services for our community. We battled this COVID virus locally by establishing free testing in various locations throughout the city and have given out nearly 1 million face masks to the public and business sector. We've also ramped up our efforts to provide mental health options for the public because we recognize that all people, our youngsters, our seniors, our most vulnerable, our homeless population, may be having an extraordinarily difficult time dealing with the challenges we're all facing today, survival through uncertainty. That's why I thought it is important to commend the work you all are doing and for your efforts in this summit to bring even greater awareness to one of the issues that COVID clearly has played a role in impacting, domestic violence in the home. With the many voices coming together on this and other needed issues, only then will we find the answers needed to fix these problems. Thank you for all that you
Thank you. That was Stephen Fulop, the mayor of Jersey City. We are running late on the agenda, so I would like to appeal to all panelists to answer the questions about shelter, visas, etc. in the Q&A box and chat box. And then let me actually start also wrapping up. We've heard powerful voices. We've heard how the pandemic has made already vulnerable groups even more vulnerable. We've heard about the domestic violence, the vulnerability of women in particular, their need for shelter, legal assistance, protection, etc., etc. We've also heard Ghida and others talk about the halving global violence movement. And I'd like to focus just on that in the last couple of sentences. Solutions, what do we need to do? Many powerful voices here have talked about the need for legal assistance, for protection, for shelters, for funding, for call centers. There's lots of different ways that we can all assist. But I think maybe the most important thing is this. We do know a lot of the solutions. We do know what it takes. What we need to do now is to remind everyone that we are short of political will to address this, and we need an awareness much higher in order for politicians and institutions to address it and put it higher up on the agenda. For that, you are crucial. So spread the words out of what you've heard today, inform others, and tell them about what is needed in order to actually fix this and build us all stronger and help the most vulnerable first. Thank you very, very much for this session. Thank you to fantastic panelists. Thank you to the organizers and hosts. Thanks to everyone who's participated, the voices from the ground, and all of you who have listened in. And I'd just like to remind you at the very end that there are networks that you can join after this session. I see Yael is nodding, so I think I'm on the right track here. And I'll just wrap up and say thank you so much and have a nice day or evening, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Actually, I was nodding to say, why won't you have the question and answer period? Is that possible?
I'm sure that there's a lot of people who are already running for new meetings, huh?
No, this is the last meeting today, so we could have had the question and answer. But
then, okay. Let's then spend 5 minutes on the following. Yael, some of us, including me, have a new meeting, you see, and there are other meetings.
I see.
But let me follow up on that direct question and actually turn it over. I think some of the questions in the chat box are directly to individuals, Leslye among others. So I'll ask them to follow up on those direct questions in the chat box and Q&A box. But I'd like to make a last round to the panelists, actually, and ask them to address one question with one sentence. And the question is the following: what is the most important thing you think needs to be addressed in order to help the situation for refugees and migrants within the framework of COVID-19 and with all the challenges that you have heard about from the ground and the other panelists? And I'll turn to you first, Richard. One sentence, the most important thing.
Thank you very much. Awareness and mobilization, 2 words, one sentence, 2 words. We cannot deal with an invisible problem unless we become aware and educated about what it is, and then we can unify to address it at all the different levels where it needs to be addressed, from the intergovernmental down to the community where it really counts. So awareness, then action. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. Leslye?
I would say creativity, flexibility, and survivor-driven responses, because what we're seeing is that the system that was designed for victims generally in the US doesn't always work for immigrant survivors and refugee survivors, but listening to them and having the survivors give us what they need, and then finding creative ways to respond that will help us not only in COVID-19, but help us serve this population better as we go forward.
Thank you very much. I'm handing it over to Ghida.
Exactly. Actually, I wanted to say people-centered. That's the most important. I would add as well, ensuring accessibility to information and adapted intervention, taking into account the unique aspect of their situation. And lastly, accountability. Ensuring feedback mechanisms, tailored feedback mechanisms where their voice can be heard on all levels.
Fantastic. Do we have still Uzoma with us?
Yeah, I, like others have said, awareness very important. That will help a lot. Thank you.
Very good. Very good. We're turning to Lilla.
I have only to add some words. Explore them, inform them about the possibilities, make it openly communicated, set up shelters, and offer mental and other support.
Thank you very much. Do we still have Balakrishnan with us, the special rapporteur?
No, we do not.
Okay. Then I think I would like to wrap up and again say thank you to everyone and also for this last round, which was solutions oriented. And I'm sure there's a lot to be followed up on in the networking after this. And please remember to address the questions in the chat box and the Q&A box and exchange contact details, etc. So with those words, big thank you to everyone, and go out and build the movement stronger. Thank you.
In addition to thanking the panel and all the panelists and voices today, we are again going to hear on our way to the networking sharing circles, Peter Campbell's anthem for the summit, Waited Too Long.
Yeah. Even before he got the key in the door, she could barely gather the will to keep going. He comes in and everything gets under his skin, and she cares which way the wind is blowing. The shame, bruises, everyone loses. Go grab some memories before they're all gone. She waited for a change in the wind, for rain, for angels with miracles and song. She waited too long. Just after the lockdown, COVID crushed their resolve, and all their dreams disappeared with his wages. Alone with a daughter, every lesson taught her a little wisdom for the world that she faces. But they're so shattered and lost. Every line that got crossed fed their fear and their anger and left them alone. Waited for courage, waited for a reason to care when they knew they couldn't keep on. Too long, they waited too long. The moment calls, then it moves on. Hesitating, it's gone. How long is too long is too long. Just when her heart was done with its heaving and her nightmare rolled off her and settled, there was a flicker of hope through the pain in the dark, and she seized it, a fistful of nettle, crept to the cradle, the helpless tangle of sleep took her up, love so tender and strong. She waited for silence, waited for their moment to run. Was she right? Was she wrong? Too long, she waited too long. The moment called. wouldn't even know he was there. At the top of the stairs, all his 4-year-old fears were forbidden. He learned not to weep, just rocked himself off to sleep. Learned what to show them, what to keep hidden. The eyes that see nothing, see everything breaking, see the trampled, see the trapped and torn. He waited for an end to the shaking, for an end to his aching, for the reason why he ever was born. Too long, we waited too long. The moment calls, but then it moves on. Hesitating, it's gone. How long is too long, is too long, is too long, is too long. How long is too long, is too long.
Thank you so much, Dr. Daniele and everyone. In a few moments, this room will close down, and then we will move on over to the circles, the networking circles. I will just post the information for those. So we look forward to seeing as many of you who can join us over there for just roundtable conversations amongst all of us.